John von Neumann laid the mathematical foundation of game theory at a moment in history when the world was struggling to understand complexity, conflict, and choice. His work did not emerge from abstract curiosity alone. It grew out of a deep desire to explain how intelligent actors behave when their decisions are tied to the decisions of others. Before von Neumann, strategy was largely understood through experience, military tradition, or philosophical reflection. He transformed it into something measurable, logical, and precise, giving humanity a new language for understanding competition and cooperation. Von Neumann's early life already hinted at the kind of thinker he would become. Born in Budapest in 1903, he demonstrated extraordinary intellectual ability at a very young age. Mathematics, logic, physics, and philosophy were not separate worlds to him, but interconnected tools for understanding reality. This broad intellectual reach mattered greatly when he began thinking about strategic behavior, because strategy itself sits at the intersection of psychology, economics, mathematics, and power. He did not merely ask how people choose, but how choices interact in structured systems. The central problem von Neumann addressed was deceptively simple. What happens when the outcome of a decision depends not just on one person's actions, but on the actions of others who are also making rational choices? Traditional mathematics was well suited for studying fixed systems, like geometry or mechanics, but human interaction introduced uncertainty, anticipation, and conflict. Von Neumann saw that these interactions followed patterns, and that those patterns could be formalized. His breakthrough came in the 1920s with the idea that strategic situations could be represented as games. These games were not entertainment in the usual sense, but structured models with players, choices, and outcomes. Each player sought to maximize their own benefit, and each understood that others were trying to do the same. This framing allowed strategy to be studied with mathematical rigor rather than intuition alone. One of von Neumann's most important contributions was the minimax theorem. This concept applied initially to zero-sum games, situations where one player's gain is exactly equal to another player's loss. The theorem proved that in such games, rational players could minimize their maximum possible loss by choosing optimal strategies. In simple terms, it showed that even in pure conflict, there exists a stable strategic solution if players act rationally. This was revolutionary. It meant that conflict was not chaotic or purely emotional, but structured and analyzable. The importance of this idea extended far beyond mathematics. It suggested that rational behavior under conflict could be predicted and guided. Military strategists, economists, and political thinkers soon realized that von Neumann had provided a tool to understand not just games, but real, world struggles for power and advantage. Decisions made in boardrooms, war rooms, and government offices could now be seen as part of strategic systems rather than isolated choices. Von Neumann's collaboration with economist Oskar Morgenstern further expanded these ideas. Their 1944 book, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, marked the formal birth of game theory as a discipline. The book argued that economics itself should be understood as a series of strategic interactions rather than simple market exchanges. Buyers and sellers, employers and workers, firms and competitors were all engaged in games where expectations, incentives, and responses mattered deeply. What made von Neumann's approach so powerful was his insistence on rationality as a starting point. He assumed that players act logically to maximize their outcomes, given the information they have. While real humans are not always perfectly rational, This assumption allowed clear models to be built. These models could then be tested, refined, and adapted. Even when reality deviated from the model, the framework provided insight into why decisions succeeded or failed. Another crucial aspect of von Neumann's foundation was his treatment of information. He recognized that not all players have the same knowledge, and that uncertainty plays a central role in strategy. This insight paved the way for later developments in game theory involving incomplete information, signaling, and expectations. The idea that what one player knows and what they believe others know can shape outcomes became central to modern strategic thinking. Von Neumann's work also emphasized that strategy is not only about direct action, but about anticipation. A rational player does not merely choose what seems best in the moment. They consider how others will react to that choice, and how those reactions will influence future decisions. This recursive thinking, where each player thinks about what others are thinking, became a defining feature of strategic analysis. Although von Neumann's original models were highly abstract, their implications were anything but theoretical. Governments quickly saw their relevance, especially during periods of global tension. The idea that conflicts could be stabilized through predictable strategies influenced defense planning and international relations. Strategic balance, deterrence, and negotiation all found intellectual support in the mathematical clarity of game theory. In business and economics, von Neumann's foundation changed how competition was understood. Firms were no longer seen as independent actors responding passively to markets. Instead, they were strategic players whose decisions influenced and were influenced by rivals. Pricing, investment, innovation, and mergers could all be studied as strategic moves within a competitive game. This shift reshaped economic theory and business education for decades. What makes von Neumann's contribution especially remarkable is that he did not live to see the full impact of his ideas. Many of the most influential developments in game theory came after his death in 1957, yet all of them rest on the foundation he built. Concepts like equilibrium, strategic dominance, and rational choice trace their intellectual lineage back to his early work. Beyond specific applications, von Neumann's greatest achievement may have been a change in mindset. He taught the world to see decision-making as interactive rather than isolated. This perspective encourages deeper thinking about consequences, incentives, and long-term effects. It reminds us that power and success often depend not on strength alone, but on understanding the structure of interaction. His approach also revealed the limits of force and control. In many strategic situations, cooperation can be as important as competition. By showing how cooperation can emerge even among self-interested players, game theory challenged simplistic views of human behavior. It suggested that rationality does not always lead to conflict, but can also support stability and mutual benefit. In a documentary-style reflection, von Neumann appears not just as a mathematician, but as an architect of modern strategic thought. His equations and proofs were tools, but his real legacy was a way of seeing the world. A world where choices are connected, where anticipation matters, and where understanding others is as important as understanding oneself. Today, when algorithms negotiate stock trades, when governments design policies to influence behavior, and when international leaders weigh decisions that affect millions, von Neumann's foundational ideas remain present. They operate quietly beneath the surface, shaping models, forecasts, and strategies. His work reminds us that behind every major decision lies a structure of interaction that can be studied, understood, and, to some extent, guided. In explaining the first keynote, it becomes clear that John von Neumann did more than invent a mathematical theory. He provided humanity with a framework for understanding strategic life itself. By turning strategic decision-making into a subject of rigorous analysis, he changed how the modern world thinks about choice, conflict, and cooperation. This foundation continues to support the systems of business, politics, and global power that define our age. Game theory explains how rational players act when their outcomes depend on the choices of others, and this idea reshaped how humans understand decision-making itself. Before this way of thinking became widespread, decisions were often treated as isolated events. A person chose an action, and the result was assumed to flow directly from that choice. Game theory disrupted this simple view by revealing that many of the most important decisions in life unfold within networks of interdependence, where every action triggers reactions, and every reaction reshapes the original decision. At the heart of this concept is rationality. In game theory, a rational player is not necessarily moral, emotional, or fair, but consistent and goal-oriented. A rational player evaluates available options, anticipates possible responses from others, and selects the action that best serves their interests given those expectations. What makes this powerful is not the assumption that people are perfectly rational in real life, but that this assumption provides a clear baseline from which behavior can be understood and analyzed. The defining feature of these situations is dependence. A player's success is not determined solely by their own effort or intelligence, but by how well they understand others. This dependence introduces strategic thinking. Instead of asking, "What is the best choice for me?" the player must ask, "What is the best choice for me, given what others might do?" This shift in perspective changes everything. It turns decision-making into a dynamic process of anticipation, prediction, and adjustment. Consider a simple competitive situation. Two individuals are pursuing the same limited opportunity. If one acts aggressively while the other acts cautiously, the outcome will favor one side. But if both act aggressively, both may suffer losses. If both act cautiously, both may benefit, but only if trust exists. Game theory captures this tension by modeling how rational players weigh risks and rewards while accounting for the uncertainty of others' behavior. The theory shows that rational decisions are not always those that appear morally right or socially beneficial, but those that make sense within the strategic structure of the interaction. One of the most profound insights of game theory is that rational behavior can sometimes lead to outcomes that are collectively worse for everyone involved. This challenges the intuitive belief that rational choices naturally produce good results. When players act in their own self-interest without coordination, they may trap themselves in situations where no one is satisfied. This insight forced economists, political scientists, and policymakers to rethink how systems are designed and how incentives shape behavior. Dependence on others' choices also introduces the importance of expectations. A player's decision depends not only on what others will do, but on what the player believes others will do. These beliefs may be accurate or mistaken, but they still guide action. Game theory shows that expectations can become self-fulfilling. If players believe others will act aggressively, they may act aggressively themselves, creating the very outcome they feared. In this way, beliefs become as powerful as actions. This insight explains why communication, signaling, and reputation matter so deeply in strategic situations. Rational players look for clues about others' intentions. A public statement, a past action, or a visible commitment can influence expectations and shift outcomes. Game theory provides a framework for understanding how these signals work and why they can stabilize or destabilize interactions. It reveals that sometimes the most important move is not what you do, but what others believe you are willing to do. Another crucial aspect of rational decision making in interdependent situations is the idea of equilibrium. An equilibrium occurs when no player has an incentive to change their strategy, given the strategies of others. This does not mean the outcome is fair or optimal, only that it is stable. The concept of equilibrium helps explain why certain patterns of behavior persist even when they seem inefficient or harmful. Once players settle into a stable set of expectations, changing behavior becomes risky, and rational players may prefer the safety of a bad outcome over the uncertainty of change. Game theory also highlights the role of timing. Decisions made sequentially create different outcomes than decisions made simultaneously. When players move one after another, earlier actions can shape later responses. Rational players understand this and may act strategically to influence future choices. This insight applies to negotiations, diplomacy, and even everyday social interactions. The order of moves, the ability to commit early, and the option to wait can all shift the balance of power. The dependence on others' choices also means that cooperation becomes a strategic problem rather than a moral one. Game theory asks under what conditions rational players will choose to cooperate, even when betrayal might offer short-term gain. The answer often lies in repetition and long-term interaction. When players expect to meet again, maintaining trust can become the rational choice. This explains why stable relationships, alliances, and institutions can emerge even among self-interested actors. At the same time, game theory shows how fragile cooperation can be. If trust is broken or incentives change, rational players may abandon cooperation quickly. This fragility explains cycles of conflict and reconciliation seen in politics, business, and international relations. The theory does not romanticize human behavior. Instead, it exposes the structural conditions that make cooperation possible or impossible. Uncertainty adds another layer of complexity. Rational players often lack complete information about others' preferences, resources, or intentions. Game theory models this uncertainty and shows how players adapt by using probabilities, assumptions, and learning. This aspect of the theory reflects real life, where decisions are made under imperfect knowledge. It also explains why mistakes, miscalculations, and unexpected outcomes are common, even among intelligent and well-informed actors. The dependence on others' choices also changes how power is understood. Power is not only about resources or force, but about influence over others' decisions. A player with the ability to shape expectations, limit options, or alter incentives can wield significant power without direct confrontation. Game theory reveals how subtle forms of influence can be more effective than overt control. In economic contexts, this insight transformed how markets are understood. Prices, wages, and investments are no longer seen as mechanical results of supply and demand alone, but as outcomes of strategic interaction. Firms anticipate competitors' moves, consumers respond to perceived value, and regulators influence behavior through rules and incentives. Each decision depends on expectations about others, creating complex feedback loops that game theory helps untangle. In political life, rational decision making under interdependence explains why leaders sometimes make compromises that appear weak, or take hardline positions that seem risky. Their choices are shaped by how others are expected to respond. Voters, rivals, allies, and opponents all influence the strategic landscape. Game theory provides a lens through which these decisions can be understood not as irrational, but as responses to strategic constraints. On the global stage, dependence on others' choices becomes a matter of survival. Nations must decide how to act under uncertainty, knowing that misinterpretation can lead to conflict. Rational leaders consider not only their own capabilities, but how their actions will be perceived and countered. Game theory helps explain deterrence, arms races, and diplomatic signaling, showing how peace and conflict can both emerge from rational calculation. What makes this keynote so important is that it challenges simplistic views of human choice. It shows that rationality does not operate in a vacuum. Decisions are embedded in systems of interaction, shaped by expectations, incentives, and mutual dependence. Understanding this reality allows individuals and institutions to design better strategies, policies, and systems. In a documentary-style reflection, the world revealed by game theory appears both sobering and empowering. Sobering because it shows how rational behavior can produce unintended and harmful outcomes. Empowering because it offers tools to recognize these patterns and, in some cases, change them. By understanding how rational players act when their outcomes depend on others, humanity gains insight into the hidden structure of conflict, cooperation, and choice. This explanation of the second keynote reveals that game theory is not just about games or mathematics. It is about the logic of interaction itself. It explains why people hesitate, why they bluff, why they cooperate, and why they sometimes fail despite acting rationally. In doing so, it provides a deeper understanding of the strategic forces that shape everyday life and global history alike. Businesses use game theory to compete, price products, and negotiate strategically, and this idea quietly reshaped the modern economic world. Long before executives spoke the language of strategy models and competitive advantage, firms already sensed that success depended not only on internal efficiency, but on understanding rivals. Game theory gave structure to this intuition. It explained that a company never acts alone. Every decision it makes exists within a web of reactions, counterreactions, and expectations formed by competitors, customers, suppliers, and regulators. In the early days of industrial capitalism, many business decisions were guided by trial and error. A company would lower prices, expand production, or enter a new market and then observe what happened. Sometimes this worked, but often it led to costly mistakes. Game theory introduced the idea that firms could anticipate outcomes before acting by thinking strategically about others' responses. This shift transformed business decision-making from reactive behavior into forward-looking analysis. Competition lies at the heart of this transformation. When two or more firms compete for the same customers, each firm's profits depend not just on its own actions, but on what its rivals choose to do. If one company cuts prices, others must decide whether to match the cut, differentiate their product, or exit the market. Game theory frames this situation as a strategic interaction, showing that the best choice depends on expectations about rivals' behavior. A price cut that seems attractive in isolation may trigger a price war that leaves everyone worse off. This insight fundamentally changed how businesses think about pricing. Prices are no longer just reflections of cost and demand. They are strategic signals. A low price may communicate aggression, a willingness to sacrifice short-term profits for long-term dominance. A high price may signal confidence in quality or brand strength. Game theory helps firms understand how these signals are interpreted by competitors and customers alike, and how misinterpretation can lead to unintended consequences. The airline industry offers a clear example of this logic. Airlines constantly adjust prices, routes, and capacity while watching one another closely. When one airline introduces a discount on a popular route, others must quickly decide how to respond. Game theory explains why airlines often match prices even when it reduces profits. Failing to respond might signal weakness and encourage further competitive pressure. Matching the price, while painful, can preserve long-term strategic balance. Beyond pricing, game theory reshaped how businesses approach product launches and innovation. Introducing a new product is rarely just a technical decision. It is a strategic move. Competitors may respond by copying features, lowering prices, or accelerating their own innovation. Game theory helps firms anticipate these responses and decide whether being first to market offers a true advantage or simply invites imitation. In some industries, waiting and learning from others' mistakes can be the rational choice. This strategic thinking also applies to market entry. When a firm considers entering a new market, it must assess not only consumer demand, but how existing players will react. Will incumbents accommodate the newcomer, or will they fight aggressively to protect their market share? Game theory provides tools to analyze these scenarios, helping firms decide whether entry is profitable or likely to trigger costly retaliation. Negotiation is another area where game theory deeply influenced business behavior. Negotiations between firms, suppliers, and partners are not isolated events, but strategic interactions shaped by power, information, and expectations. Game theory explains why revealing too much information can weaken a negotiating position, and why credible commitments can strengthen it. It shows that negotiation outcomes depend not only on what is offered, but on what each side believes the other is willing to accept. In labor negotiations, for example, companies and workers engage in repeated strategic interactions. Each side weighs the costs of conflict against the benefits of cooperation. Game theory helps explain why strikes occur, why compromises are sometimes delayed, and why agreements often reflect strategic balance rather than fairness alone. By understanding these dynamics, firms can design negotiation strategies that reduce conflict and increase the chances of stable agreements. Game theory also transformed how businesses think about cooperation with competitors. At first glance, cooperation among rivals seems irrational or even illegal. Yet in many industries, limited cooperation emerges naturally. Firms may agree on standards, share infrastructure, or avoid destructive price wars. Game theory explains how such cooperation can arise among interested actors, especially when interactions are repeated and reputations matter. At the same time, game theory highlights the fragility of cooperation. If incentives change or trust erodes, cooperation can quickly collapse. This insight helps explain why cartels often fail and why regulatory oversight is necessary to maintain fair competition. Firms may recognize the mutual benefits of cooperation, but individual incentives to defect remain powerful. Information plays a crucial role in all of these strategic decisions. Businesses rarely operate with complete knowledge. They do not fully know competitors' costs, plans, or internal constraints. Game theory models this uncertainty and shows how firms act under incomplete information. Advertising, public announcements, and even silence can all serve as strategic signals. A company's decision to expand capacity, for example, may signal confidence and deter entry, even if the expansion is costly. This understanding of signaling reshaped marketing and branding strategies. Brands are not just tools to attract customers. They are strategic assets that influence competitors' perceptions. A strong brand can deter entry by making competition appear less profitable. Game theory explains why firms invest heavily in branding even when short-term returns are unclear. The investment sends a signal about long-term commitment and competitive strength. Game theory also influenced corporate strategy at the highest level. Mergers and acquisitions, for instance, are deeply strategic moves. When one firm acquires another, competitors reassess the balance of power. Some may respond by merging themselves, others by specializing or exiting. Game theory helps explain merger waves and the cascading effects they produce across industries. In technology markets, strategic interaction becomes even more complex. Network effects mean that the value of a product increases as more people use it. Game theory explains why firms may initially offer products at low or even zero prices to build a user base, anticipating that competitors will struggle to catch up once the network is established. This logic underlies many strategies in software, social media, and digital platforms. The influence of game theory extends inside organizations as well. Managers design incentive systems to align employees' interests with company goals. Game theory reveals how poorly designed incentives can encourage unintended behavior, such as excessive risk-taking or internal competition. By understanding strategic interaction within the firm, leaders can create structures that promote cooperation and long-term performance. Game theory also changed how businesses interact with governments and regulators. Firms anticipate regulatory responses and may adjust behavior to influence policy outcomes. Governments, in turn, design regulations to shape corporate incentives. This strategic interaction influences everything from environmental policy to financial regulation. Game theory provides a framework for understanding these complex relationships without assuming goodwill or bad faith. Over time, the adoption of game theoretic thinking made businesses more strategic, but also more cautious. Firms learned that aggressive moves can provoke retaliation, and that short-term gains may lead to long-term losses. This does not mean businesses became less competitive. Rather, competition became more calculated. Strategic restraint often replaced impulsive action. In a documentary-style reflection, the modern business world appears as a vast strategic landscape shaped by invisible calculations. Executives may not always speak in mathematical terms, but their decisions reflect game theoretic logic. They ask how rivals will respond, how customers will interpret actions, and how today's move will shape tomorrow's options. These questions trace directly back to the insights of game theory. Explaining this keynote reveals that game theory did not simply add a new tool to business. It changed the way business itself is understood. Competition became a structured interaction rather than a chaotic struggle. Pricing became a signal rather than a number. Negotiation became a strategic game rather than a battle of personalities. Through these shifts, game theory embedded strategic thinking at the core of modern commerce, shaping the behavior of firms and the structure of markets in lasting ways. Political leaders apply game theory to elections, diplomacy, and public policy, and this application fundamentally altered how power is exercised and understood in modern societies. Politics has never been just about ideals or moral arguments. It has always been a strategic contest among actors with competing interests. What game theory did was make this contest visible, structured, and analyzable. It revealed that political outcomes are not simply the result of good intentions or strong leadership, but of strategic interaction shaped by incentives, expectations, and mutual dependence. In democratic elections, game theory offers a lens to understand why candidates behave the way they do. Voters often assume politicians choose positions based on personal beliefs or party ideology, but strategic reasoning plays a central role. Candidates must consider not only what they believe, but how voters will respond, how opponents will counter, and how small shifts in support can change the final outcome. A policy position that appeals strongly to one group may alienate another, and game theory helps explain how politicians balance these trade-offs. Campaign strategies reflect this logic clearly. Decisions about where to campaign, which issues to emphasize, and which voters to target are based on expectations about opponents' actions and voter reactions. Game theory explains why candidates often move toward the political center rather than staying at ideological extremes. If both sides aim to capture the largest share of undecided voters, moderation can become the rational strategy, even if it disappoints core supporters. This behavior is not a failure of conviction, but a strategic response to competitive pressure. Voting behavior itself also reflects strategic interaction. Voters do not always vote for their most preferred candidate. They sometimes vote strategically to prevent an undesirable outcome. Game theory explains why voters may support a less preferred but more viable candidate to block another they strongly oppose. This strategic voting shapes election results and reinforces the importance of expectations, polls, and perceptions of viability. Coalition politics further illustrates the power of strategic reasoning. In many political systems, no single party holds absolute power, forcing parties to negotiate alliances. Game theory helps explain why certain coalitions form while others do not. Parties evaluate not only policy compatibility, but bargaining power, future elections, and the stability of agreements. A party may choose a less ideologically aligned partner if it offers greater long-term advantage or control. Diplomacy is another arena where game theoretic thinking is deeply embedded. International relations involve states that pursue security, influence, and prosperity while responding to the actions of others. Diplomats must anticipate reactions, manage perceptions, and send signals that shape expectations. Game theory clarifies why diplomatic statements are often ambiguous, why commitments must be credible, and why threats sometimes fail to deter. In negotiations between states, outcomes depend not only on what is demanded, but on what each side believes the other is willing to concede. Game theory explains why nations may adopt tough public positions while privately remaining flexible. Public firmness can strengthen bargaining power by signaling resolve, even if compromise remains possible behind the scenes. This dual behavior often confuses observers, but makes sense within a strategic framework. Deterrence is one of the clearest examples of game theory in politics. A state seeks to prevent aggression not by eliminating threats, but by convincing potential adversaries that the cost of aggression will outweigh any benefit. This requires credible commitment. Game theory shows that deterrence fails when threats are not believable. As a result, states invest heavily in demonstrating capability and resolve, sometimes through actions that appear excessive or provocative. Public policy design also reflects strategic interaction. Governments do not simply pass laws and expect compliance. They anticipate how citizens, businesses, and institutions will respond. Game theory helps policymakers understand how incentives shape behavior. A tax policy, for example, influences not only revenue but work, investment, and avoidance strategies. If incentives are poorly aligned, rational actors may exploit loopholes or resist compliance. This strategic perspective explains why punishment alone is often ineffective. If penalties are too harsh or inconsistently applied, they may encourage evasion rather than cooperation. Game theory suggests that policies work best when they align individual incentives with collective goals. This insight has influenced areas such as environmental regulation, public health, and education policy. In international organizations, strategic interaction becomes even more complex. Multiple states with diverse interests must coordinate decisions. Game theory helps explain why agreements are often slow, why enforcement is difficult, and why institutions rely on norms and reputation rather than force. States cooperate not because they are altruistic, but because long-term benefits outweigh short-term temptations to defect. Game theory also sheds light on political conflict and protest. Governments and citizens engage in strategic interaction when legitimacy is contested. Protesters decide how far to push, while governments decide how to respond. Excessive repression may fuel resistance, while excessive concession may encourage further demands. Game theory explains why both sides often test each other through gradual escalation rather than immediate confrontation. Media and political communication are deeply strategic as well. Politicians craft messages not just to inform, but to influence beliefs and expectations. Game theory explains why politicians sometimes avoid clear statements, why framing matters, and why symbolic actions can have real political effects. Voters interpret signals, update beliefs, and respond accordingly, creating feedback loops that shape political discourse. Power, in this framework, is no longer just about authority or force. It is about the ability to influence others' choices. A leader who can shape expectations, set agendas, or limit alternatives may wield more power than one with formal authority alone. Game theory reveals these subtle forms of power and explains why seemingly weak actors can sometimes achieve strong outcomes through strategic positioning. This way of thinking also explains political paralysis. When actors fear that compromise will be exploited, they may choose inaction over risk. Game theory shows how rational fear of betrayal can lead to gridlock, even when cooperation would benefit everyone. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why political systems sometimes struggle to address urgent problems. In a documentary-style view of politics shaped by game theory, leaders appear less as heroic individuals and more as strategic players constrained by incentives and expectations. Their choices are shaped by electoral pressures, institutional rules, and the anticipated responses of others. This perspective does not excuse unethical behavior, but it helps explain why good intentions often collide with strategic reality. Explaining this keynote reveals that game theory transformed politics by making strategy explicit. It exposed the hidden logic behind campaigns, negotiations, and policies. It showed that political outcomes are rarely accidental. They emerge from structured interaction among rational actors pursuing their interests within constraints. By understanding this logic, citizens and leaders alike gain a clearer view of how power operates and how it might be used more effectively and responsibly. Game theory reshaped global power dynamics, especially during the Cold War, by changing how nations understood conflict, survival, and decision-making under extreme risk. Before this period, international power was often interpreted through visible factors such as military size, territory, and economic strength. While these elements still mattered, game theory introduced a deeper and more unsettling realization. Power in the modern world depended just as much on perception, expectation, and strategic restraint as it did on weapons or armies. Global power became a game of anticipation, where the most important moves were often the ones never made. After the Second World War, the world entered an era unlike any before. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, possessed weapons capable of destroying not just armies or cities, but civilization itself. Traditional theories of war offered little guidance for this new reality. Winning a nuclear war was meaningless if victory meant total annihilation. Game theory provided a framework to understand this paradox. It showed that when rational actors face catastrophic consequences, avoiding conflict can become the most rational strategy of all. At the center of this new strategic thinking was deterrence. Deterrence was not about fighting wars, but about preventing them. Game theory explained that a nation could discourage aggression by making the cost of attack unbearably high for its opponent. This required more than having powerful weapons. It required convincing others that those weapons would be used if necessary. Power, therefore, became psychological as much as physical. A nation had to shape its rivals' expectations, not just its capabilities. This logic led to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The idea was simple but terrifying. If two adversaries both possessed the ability to destroy each other completely, then neither would rationally choose to attack. Game theory showed that stability could emerge from balance, even when both sides were hostile. This balance was not based on trust or goodwill, but on fear and rational calculation. Each side understood that initiating conflict would guarantee its own destruction. What made this situation uniquely game theoretic was the role of anticipation. Leaders were not just deciding what to do, they were deciding how others would interpret their actions. A military exercise, a weapons test, or a diplomatic statement could all be seen as signals. Game theory revealed that misinterpretation could be deadly. A move intended as defense might be perceived as preparation for attack, triggering escalation. As a result, restraint itself became a strategic signal. This way of thinking transformed how global power was exercised. Superpowers avoided direct military confrontation and instead competed through proxy wars, alliances, and influence. Game theory explains why conflicts erupted in places far from the superpowers' borders. Fighting indirectly reduced the risk of escalation, while still allowing each side to pursue strategic advantage. These proxy conflicts were tragic and destructive, but they reflected rational calculations shaped by the fear of direct confrontation. Arms races also took on a new meaning through game theory. At first glance, building more weapons seems irrational when both sides already have enough to destroy each other. Yet game theory explains why arms races occurred. Each side feared falling behind, believing that even a small imbalance could undermine deterrence. Power was no longer about superiority, but about maintaining credibility. A nation needed to ensure that its threat remained believable under all circumstances. This led to complex, strategic decisions about weapons development. Leaders had to consider not only what weapons to build, but how those weapons would affect perceptions. Defensive systems, for example, could destabilize deterrence if they made one side feel invulnerable. Game theory revealed that even defensive improvements could provoke aggressive responses. As a result, restraint in certain areas became a form of strategic wisdom. Diplomacy during the Cold War was deeply shaped by these insights. Negotiations over arms control were not expressions of trust, but strategic efforts to stabilize expectations. Treaties limited certain weapons not because rivals trusted one another, but because both recognized that unchecked competition increased the risk of disaster. Game theory helped explain why verification mechanisms were essential. Agreements mattered only if both sides believed cheating would be detected and punished. Crisis situations demonstrated the power of game theoretic thinking most vividly. During moments of extreme tension, leaders faced decisions with enormous consequences and limited information. Game theory highlighted the dangers of brinkmanship, where each side pushes the other closer to the edge in hopes of forcing concessions. While brinkmanship could succeed, it also carried the risk of accidental escalation. Rational leaders had to balance firmness with restraint, strength with caution. Global power during this era also depended on reputation. Game theory showed that how a nation behaved in one situation could influence expectations in future encounters. Backing down too easily could encourage further challenges, while excessive aggression could provoke resistance. Leaders became acutely aware that each decision sent signals beyond its immediate context. Power was exercised across time, not just in the present moment. Alliances took on strategic importance as well. Game theory explains why collective defense agreements mattered even when members had unequal power. Alliances changed the structure of the game by increasing the cost of aggression. An attack on one state could trigger a broader response, altering the attacker's calculations. Power, therefore, became distributed across networks rather than concentrated in single actors. Smaller states were not powerless in this system. Game theory revealed that even weaker actors could influence outcomes by positioning themselves strategically. By aligning with stronger powers or exploiting rivalries, smaller nations could increase their security or bargaining power. Global power dynamics became more complex, with influence flowing through strategic relationships rather than raw strength alone. The Cold War also demonstrated the limits of rationality. While game theory assumed rational actors, real-world decision makers were human, subject to fear, pride, and misperception. Yet even this limitation reinforced the importance of game theoretic thinking. Recognizing human fallibility made communication, clarity, and caution even more critical. Systems were designed to reduce the risk of accidental war, such as hotlines and confidence building measures. As the Cold War ended, the influence of game theory did not disappear. Instead, it adapted to a changing world. Global power became more diffuse, involving multiple actors, non-state groups, and economic forces. Yet the core insight remained: outcomes depend on strategic interaction. Nations continued to assess not just their own actions, but how those actions would be perceived and countered by others. In a documentary-style reflection, the Cold War appears not only as a struggle of ideologies, but as a vast strategic game played under the shadow of annihilation. Game theory did not make the world safer by eliminating conflict, but by clarifying the logic of restraint. It helped leaders understand that survival depended on avoiding certain moves, on recognizing shared vulnerabilities, and on managing fear through predictable behavior. Explaining this keynote reveals that game theory fundamentally altered the meaning of global power. Power was no longer just the ability to win wars, but the ability to prevent them. It was the capacity to shape expectations, maintain credibility, and navigate danger without triggering catastrophe. In this sense, game theory did more than analyze global power, it helped redefine it. Even today, as new forms of conflict emerge, the lessons remain relevant. Nuclear deterrence, cyber warfare, and economic sanctions all involve strategic interaction under uncertainty. The world continues to operate within structures first clarified during the Cold War. The legacy of game theory endures as a reminder that in a deeply interconnected world, the most powerful decisions are often those guided by understanding, anticipation, and restraint rather than force alone.